Our original Aerodactyl video is stunningly 9 years old, being uploaded on August 13th, 2017. So today we're looking at the history in the earlier generations once again, as well as the many developments that have taken place since then. We've got a lot to get through with this Gen 1 fan favorite, so we're jumping right in and asking, how great was Aerodactyl actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Gen 1 Aerodactyl is a well and truly desolate Pokemon, which might seem strange at first glance, because on paper, it seems exceedingly well suited for Gen 1. Its immense 130 base speed not only lets it outrun hugely important Pokemon like Tauros, Starmie, and Alakazam, but it gives it an extraordinarily critical hit rate of slightly over 25%, which goes well with its solid 105 base attack. Additionally, not only does it resist normal, hugely valuable in the Hyper Beam generation, thanks to its ground immunity, it is the only Pokemon in Gen 1 to resist normal and Earthquake in tandem, potentially letting it pull some neat tricks against another iconic Gen 1 Pokemon, Snorlax. Sure, Aerodactyl is frail, but there's so much to like here. Ready to brandish Stab Rock Slide alongside the coverage of Earthquake to hit everything in the game for at least solid damage. Oh, what's that? It doesn't get Earthquake? Well, that's unfortunate. But it really only misses out on hitting Rhydon and Jolteon. Definitely a blow, but not a deal breaker. Oh, it's actually way worse than that, because Aerodactyl doesn't even get Rock Slide, despite the fact that it's a TM move in Gen 1? Yeah, never mind, it makes sense. Game Freak straight up just said no Rock Stab for Aerodactyl, not even Rock Throw. But sure, Ekans can get Rock Slide. Aerodactyl does have Stab from its other type, Flying, but both options, Fly and Sky Attack, are 2-turn and thus exceedingly easy to play around. Maybe if Aerodactyl had some other tricks to use, it could get some use out of Sky Attack's highly appealing power, but certainly not when all it's threatening are non-stab double legends, which are still only 100 base power in Gen 1. Funnily enough, Aerodactyl does have a niche in Ubers of all places. It completely dedicates itself to the stall route, using Reflect of all things, alongside Rest, in order to stonewall none other than Swords Dance Mew. Aerodactyl won't actually muster anything in the way of meaningful damage, but being able to sit on Mew and Snorlax for that matter is useful for some defensively minded teams, though it's incredibly specific and was truly the only niche Aerodactyl had. Even all the way down in NU, the moveset listed on the Smoke Index is literally called Don't Use Aerodactyl. What a strange debut generation. This leads us into the second, which was also odd, though in a different way. But before we talk about the next generation, spoilers, Aerodactyl is currently an amazing Pokemon in Pokemon Champions, and you can use Aerodactyl in Champions on today's sponsor, the Red Magic Astra 2 Gaming Tablet. The Red Magic Astra 2 Gaming Tablet is one of the best gaming tablets out there, thanks to its Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 chipset. And I'm honestly surprised we got this video done, since I've been too busy playing Pokemon Champions on this tablet. It looks amazing on this tablet, and the best part is, the tablet literally never gets hot, and that's because of its liquid metal cooling system that you can see on the back of the tablet. This cooling system spreads heat throughout the tablet so well that it will never overheat. And Champions also isn't the only game that runs well. More resource demanding games such as Zenless Zone Zero never stutter and run at max FPS on a 185Hz screen. Wow, that's a higher refresh rate than my computer monitor. And of course, Pocket TCG has never looked nicer when you pull those packs. It also runs for hours and charges really fast thanks to its 8300 mAh battery. I will never be able to focus on work again. So if you want the best gaming tablet and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click my link in the description below to learn more about the Red Magic Astra 2 gaming tablet. The good news, Aerodactyl now has access to Earthquake. The bad news, it still didn't have access to Rock Slide, which now brandished its soon-to-be famous 30% flinch chance, yet at this point was being given to newcomers like Totodile. The kind of good news, Aerodactyl did have access to Rock Stab now, thanks to the introduction of Hidden Power. This wasn't exactly good, but it was a whole lot better than nothing. This still didn't mean it had any viability in OU though. Its typing had promise, its normal resist was valuable once again in the age of King Snorlax, and Aerodactyl actually offered something no other Pokemon could do, which was take on boosting Snorlax regardless of if its coverage was Earthquake or Fire Blast. Stall teams were forced to split their Quake Lax and Fire Lax checks into two different Pokemon, Snorlax for Quake Lax, a Ghost or Rock type for Fire Lax, but Aerodactyl theoretically offered incredible roll compression by taking up just one team slot to handle both these behemoths. Anything that even slightly takes on Gen 2 Snorlax merits at least a look, but despite many of the generation's most enterprising minds doing so, their looks didn't lead anywhere. anywhere. Aerodactyl was simply too weak and passive against literally everything that wasn't Snorlax, and Thunder meant even Snorlax would be able to overwhelm Aerodactyl. It was relegated to not but gimmick teams. But could Aerodactyl at least find something to do in lower tiers? Well, no, but actually yes. For a long time it languished in BL, deemed too strong for UU thanks to its tremendous speed and the fact that it had actual stab now. However, as the UU metagame developed, the player base found Scyther, always one of the most prominent threats, to be increasingly broken, to the point of debatable brokenness. Banning Scyther was off the table though, but what about dropping down Aerodactyl? After all, Aerodactyl was in BL off of historical precedent more than anything else, and had been thrown in the tier largely off of, for lack of a better term, vibes. Upon closer inspection, it would be very difficult to argue for Aerodactyl even being one of the better Pokemon in UU, let alone being broken. So Aerodactyl was tested, and lo and behold, destroyed the metagame it did not, but it did become a legitimate part of it. It shut Scyther down as hard as advertised, while, unlike its Scyther-checking predecessor and fellow base 130 speed Pokemon Crobat, it was actually able to deal some decent damage to opponents in return. After a curse boost, HP Rock and Earthquake hit quite hard, and best of all, Aerodactyl's tremendous speed meant it still ran some top tier Pokemon even after the speed drop, most notably Hypno and Ampharos. More importantly though, was Aerodactyl's defensive utility. In addition to stifling Scyther, it also excelled at taking on another powerful bug, Pinsir, and utilized its normal resistance to good effect against Cursed Granbull, Cursed Porygon, and Swords Dance Blossom as well, easily winning a potential Curse War with Whirlwind in its last slot. Aerodactyl also stuck around against these Pokemon for quite a while thanks to the built-in longevity of its Spikes immunity. Aerodactyl was an invaluable addition to defensive teams in Gen 2 UU. It was an unorthodox second generation, but not a bad one. Everything was about to change though, as we venture into Generation 3. Finally, Aerodactyl gained Rock Slide, no more hidden power for its Rock Stab. Instead, it was now free to use hidden power flying. In addition to 2 useful stabs, Gen 3 also came with the benefit of allowing Aerodactyl to use Double Edge without recoil, thanks to the introduction of abilities leading it to receive Rock Head, and of course the introduction of Choice Band, giving Aerodactyl the instant power boost it needed. It was practically a brand new Pokemon, and what did it do with its new tools? It became one of the most defining threats in a metagame, that's what. Aerodactyl functioned somewhat akin to a Choice Scarfer in later generations, as it was tied for the best speed in the metagame, but whereas most Scarfers could struggle to put dents in teams, Aerodactyl revenge killing just about everything came with the power of Choice Band, letting it simultaneously act as a wall breaker. This was a tremendous trait for a Pokemon that outran everything unboosted, and even some boosted Pokemon like Adamant Dragon Dance Gyarados and Jolly Tyranitar. And as if this revenge killer being such an outstanding wall breaker wasn't enough, Aerodactyl was actually incredibly resilient for such a seemingly frail Pokemon thanks to its immunity to the tier's defining forces of passive damage, Sandstorm, and Spikes, forces which Aerodactyl in turn thrived at using itself, given how affected its would-be checks were by Spikes and some, like Suicune and Milotic, being further affected by Sand denying their leftovers as well. Aerodactyl naturally hit pretty much everything for good damage, but some teams pushed it even further by boosting its attack with an adamant nature, which it could mostly get away with since it was just that much faster than everything else. It lost out on certain key targets though, like Starmie and the aforementioned Jolly Dragon Dance Tyranitar, but the power upgrade was huge for a Pokemon most teams just barely hung on against in the first place, since Aerodactyl hit the field so often and effortlessly thanks not only to its aforementioned longevity, but also its ability to pivot into Earthquakes. It actually got better at this over time, since as the meta progressed, its ability to counter the increasingly popular Charizard became increasingly valuable. While its strongest move against a fully neutral target like Blissey or Snorlax was actually Double Edge, Aerodactyl's long-awaited Rock Slide wasn't just its own signature, but one of the most iconic trademarks of Gen 3 OU as a whole. The nasty 30% flinch rate, well actually 27% with its 90% accuracy factored in, which is still nasty, shaped pretty much the entire metagame in conjunction with Aerodactyl's nigh peerless speed. It wasn't enough to just be able to take Rock Slides decently once or twice. You had to withstand them repeatedly if you didn't want to be a flinch away from losing. This meant you needed Rock Resist, and reliable Rock Resist at that. Many players thought they could cheat against Aerodactyl by stacking physically bulky Rock neutral Pokemon like Skarmory and Suicune with maybe a Magneton to help out, but they would regularly be punished for doing so. Aerodactyl regularly cleaned through late games, whether through its own power or with an assist from a flinch or two, so consistently enabled by Sand and Spikes that it became one of the metagame's strongest, most defining team styles, especially since Sand meant Tyranitar, which usually meant more Rock Slides with which to bombard the opponent, eventually breaking down their defenses for Aerodactyl to clean up late game, or Tyranitar itself with Dragon Dance for that matter. But its Rock Slides came in many forms, especially threatening when forming a double Choice Band core with Aerodactyl to overwhelm the duel's standard and answer, Swampert, incredibly quickly. Beyond Rock Slide, Aerodactyl's stab hidden power flying was also threatening, but was eventually overtaken as the standard by HP Bug. The extra push against Celebi was huge for teams that relied on Aerodactyl to deny Calm Minds or Swords Dances being baton passed. While it had improved coverage in being able to threaten Celebi and opposing Tyranitar in the same move, preventing the latter from pivoting in and potentially wearing Aerodactyl down with Pursuit. As Claydol rose in metagame standing and usage, Aerodactyl appreciated being able to threaten it with greater damage as well. Hidden Power Flying's other super effective targets, mostly Heracross, were generally dealt with by Sand, Spikes, and Aerodactyl's other hits anyway. That said, Hidden Power Flying's coverage was appreciated, i.e. being able to hit Gengar and Swampert in the same move. But that still wasn't all. Some teams went even further by trying Hidden Power Fighting. It seemed like redundant coverage alongside Earthquake, and it couldn't be achieved with a perfect speed IV, meaning Aerodactyl wouldn't be able to speed tie opposing Aerodactyl and Jolteon with it, but it served one very specific important function. On certain unique balance teams that were otherwise solid but a bit soft into Dragon Dance Tyranitar, they could utilize Hidden Power Fighting Aerodactyl to pivot in on the Dragon Dance and KO it even from full health, which Earthquake couldn't do, thus patching up their biggest weakness. Some experimentation also came in the form of dropping Aerodactyl's Choice Band entirely. As it turned out, it was a great partner for the aforementioned Swords Dance Baton Bash Celebi, but locking into one move even with +2 attack and a Choice Band generally wouldn't get it too far. Instead, Aerodactyl would drop not only Choice Band, but also Hidden Power in order to run a set, with Substitute and Lychee Berry, allowing it to switch attacks and crucially go up to +3 attack when needed. It was quite a ferocious cleaner in this regard, albeit specific, but not as specific as the wonky Substitute, Protect, Toxic, Flamethrower set with Pressure as the ability that a few players toyed with. At the end of the day though, Choice Band was Aerodactyl, and Choice Band Aerodactyl was one of the most defining Pokemon in Advance. Now on to Generation 4, where Aerodactyl wouldn't reach its previous metagame crushing heights, but would be once again defined by one completely one-of-a-kind moveset. In fact, the moveset that would follow it around for generations, the Focus Sash Stealth Rocker, taking advantage of Aerodactyl's perfect, indeed peerless position to participate in Gen 4's defining lead metagame, where it was all about Stealth Rock. Turn 1 positioning revolving around setting your own, preventing the opponent from setting their own, or at least punishing them for doing so. Lead Aerodactyl became one of the most recognizable faces in the metagame, synonymous with fast-paced offense. Barring the Deoxys speed that was only briefly allowed in Diamond and Pearl, Aerodactyl was the fastest user of Stealth Rock and Taunt in the game. Azelf was the default as the Gen 4 Stealth Rock lead thanks to its greater attacking power, most notably its powerful explosion, giving it a chance to take something out after getting rocks up. But that was precisely Aerodactyl's great advantage. It beat the most defining lead in the metagame, one that was otherwise actually quite difficult to stop from doing its thing. But despite Azelf's reliability in adapting his moveset to take on just about everything else, barring an extremely rare, bordering on non-existent Trick Scarf set, it couldn't stop Aerodactyl from beating it to the punch regarding the Stealth Rock advantage that was these leads' entire reason for existing. As a significant bonus, Aerodactyl also had much better matchups against Tyranitar and Heatran leads. The Aero Azelf playstyle of sacrificing the lead early for a Stealth Rock advantage received some criticism during Diamond and Pearl's tenure as the current generation, as it seemed a strange strategy to go 5-6 so early in the game for. But not only did it continue to be used, it consistently succeeded and ultimately proved the overwhelming power of Stealth Rock, as being the fastest to prevent it and also set it was always useful, making it in fact reasonable to sacrifice for such ideal conditions. For example, following up with Dragon Dance Gyarados, who was a terror without Stealth Rock on its own side, and with rocks digging into its own checks, potentially running over teams right from the get-go. Azelf was of course great, but what did you do when you didn't want to deal with a potential Azelf speed tie? You went with Aerodactyl. Aerodactyl actually had some variety to its lead set too, though you couldn't really go wrong with the standard, whose biggest choice was between the higher power of Stone Edge or the flinch rate and greater accuracy of Rock Slide. Aerodactyl sometimes used a Power Herb set for a no-charge Sky Attack, completely turning the tables on the lead Machamp that had become popular and was one of its greatest punishers. Yes, its frailty left it far more vulnerable without a sash, but being able to turn the tables in such a crucial matchup was well worth the occasional use, especially as even in the event of a sash Machamp that would later be used, Sky Attack still possessed its own nifty 30% flinch rate, and Aerodactyl could still actually survive Dynamic Punch or Ice Punch without its own sash. Sky Attack's extra power was also effective for a surprisingly powerful smack against something like Swampert, and the lack of taunt was hardly missed given how few Pokemon would even try to Stealth Rock against Aerodactyl in the first place. Alternatively, Aerodactyl could switch things up by keeping Sash but using Double Edge without Rock Head as its ability. This way, once it hit 1 HP, it could sacrifice itself and thus prevent Starmie from KOing it with Rapid Spin, thus preserving its crucial Stealth Rock. What about non-lead Aerodactyl sets though? Post Salaman's ban, exactly that began to pop up. The Life Orb attacker boosted Stone Edges and Earthquakes, hit much of the tier hard, and with Taunt and Roost, Aerodactyl absolutely demolished a would-be answer in Skarmory. With Hazard support, it was generally quite a threat to Stall teams. It was by no means solely useful against Stall either. It actually performed well against offense too, utilizing its new special defense boost under the common Sandstorm to counter Heatran incredibly well, while its enormous speed allowed it to outrun the tier's 3 big Dragon Dancers after a boost: Adamant Gyarados, Adamant Dragonite, and Jolly Tyranitar, once again letting it act akin to a Scarfer, while its speed was generally superb for outrunning other big threats like Starmie, Gengar, and Infernape. However, this set, as well as the extra niche Sub-Roost Taunt Rock Slide set used on certain specific yet successful Stall teams, wound up fading away over time, as it was unable to hurt the Breloom that was coming to increasingly dominate the metagame, and Stall teams became more aggressive, making them naturally become more resilient against it as well. What stuck around though was the Sash set. Sure, sometimes it'd be more popular than others, but it was always there as part of the metagame to account for, and whenever Azelf would start getting too comfortable, Aerodactyl were reminded to tread cautiously. Though far from flashy, and usually fainting within the first few turns of a game, Aerodactyl was an incredibly important part of the 4th generation of OU. Now to Generation 5, where Team Preview was introduced, and the idea of a dedicated Sash Stealth Rock lead became ridiculous. Well, at first. Turns out committing to early rocks and a hard-hitting game plan was still an effective strategy, especially with all the insane new boosting Pokemon and moves Gen 5 introduced. Deoxys Speed was around for a while, and when that was banned, good old Azelf took over for teams that wanted a faster alternative to Deoxys defense, which was also banned. But since Azelf Hyper Offense was no longer such a dominant team style, and Team Preview meant teams could naturally adapt to it more effectively, Aerodactyl didn't really enter the equation until way down the line, when Hyper Offense teams had really established themselves as fearsome by virtue of how well their onslaught of Volcarona and friends matched up against the dominant Sand Balance teams. Such teams didn't necessarily even use Azelf as their rocker. In fact, Sash Rock's Garchomp was the standard, but certain variants did eventually come around to using Aerodactyl for the simple fact of its peerless speed, taking no chances with being able to deny opposing rocks when they wanted to enable multi-scale Dragonite and its aforementioned Volcarona to the best of their destructive potential. It was incredibly specific, a niche choice within a particular team style, but lead Aerodactyl did eventually wind up with this small place in the tier. On the other hand, Aerodactyl had quite a presence in the lower tiers. It was excellent in Black and White 1 UU, when the tier was dominated by Hippowdon Sand teams, with Chandelure crushing much of the tier, and Alakazam being a terrifying cleaner alongside the spikes laid by Roserade. And this was precisely why Aerodactyl was so good. It wasn't just a strong cleaner itself, but with its unique combination of its Sand special defense boost, being able to outrun Alakazam and pursue it was in an entirely exceptional position to not just check one of the biggest threats itself, but take it out of the game. It could also do the same against Chandelure and clean up late game itself. Eventually, Sand was banned from UU, leaving Aerodactyl without its all-important special defense boost, and thus without its niche. But that was just fine, because Aerodactyl's real home in Gen 5 was the new low tier on the block, RU. Aerodactyl was an excellent RU Pokemon. It was quite a threat, cutting through much of the tier with ease, with Life Orbs, Stone Edges, Earthquakes, and even Fire Blasts, in spite of its low special attack, thanks to how much harder it let a great would-be answer in Steelix, as well as utterly destroy Ferroseed, Escavalier, and Durant. Aerodactyl's real value, though, was similar to its tenure in early UU. It wasn't just that it was such a great attacker, with its power being amplified by its incredible speed, but the fact that it did this while checking one of the most frightening Pokemon in the tier. This time the threat was Moltres, one of the best Pokemon in the meta, whose dual stabs alongside Hidden Power Grass destroyed just about everything in sight. Now, Aerodactyl hardly shrugged its hits off easily. Moltres was incredibly strong, and Aerodactyl wasn't exactly bulky, but what it did do was both switch into and outspeed Moltres, which was otherwise non-existent, and of course had Rock Stab to threaten it out with a decisive one-hit KO, letting Aerodactyl roost up to do it again. Plus, Aerodactyl was so much faster than the rest of the tier, it could easily invest in some bulky Vs to weather the hits a little better. Aerodactyl's Stealth Rock weakness didn't help, but then again, Moltres had it even worse in this regard, so it was just barely balanced out, imperfect an answer though it was, in a metagame where most everything else got trashed crashed immediately, Aerodactyl was a welcome respite against such a nigh unstoppable, meta-defining monster. It could also extend this team support further by utilizing Stealth Rock over Fire Blast. It would be less threatening in its own right, but on teams that relied on its Moltres checking more, it would generally be more focused on maintaining its own health than all-out wall breaking anyway. Even when Moltres wasn't around, Aerodactyl was consistently useful thanks to the opportunities afforded to it to throw its powerful attacks around by its speed. It was especially popular alongside spike stacking, so even walls like Alomomola and Rhydon would struggle against it. Overall, Aerodactyl had quite an eventful, successful 5th generation, and that was before the 6th generation gave it a mega evolution. It wasn't quite on par with the other megas that define OU. It wasn't quite strong enough relative to its bulk, though those had both been improved. It did have a niche in that its speed had been boosted to incredible levels, which alongside its typing allowed it to take on a plethora of OU threats, most notably Mega Charizard Y and Talonflame, though it didn't quite do so consistently enough relative to its mega competition. So though its niche was acknowledged, it was very rarely seen. Mega Aerodactyl also had the slightest of niches on very specific hyper offense teams and Auras Ubers, often pairing with a spiker to an incredibly fast Stealth Rocker and Taunter to shut down would-be Defox from Arceus, while also matching up quite well against Mega Salamence and even Primal Groudon. But this was also used very few times before becoming relegated to more of a lip service role. Where Mega Aerodactyl really came to shine was UU. In fact, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say UU was straight up Mega Aerodactyl's metagame. It was easily the best Mega, and with no shortage of strong competition either. There were plenty of others to pick from, yet they all lived in Mega Aerodactyl's shadow, with no greater example than Mega Beedrill, which would have been much more of a threat than it actually wound up being were it not dominated so thoroughly by Mega Aerodactyl. Beyond its status as the best of the Megas, Mega Aerodactyl had a strong argument for just being the best Pokemon in the tier, period. It did it all, and it did it all amazingly. So what did all consist of? Most generically, it was a strong, fast physical attacker, like a much improved version of its base form. It now got to consistently wield dual stabs as its hard-hitting Stone Edge was now paired with Wing Attack, which would be weak if not for the excellent boost that it got from the Tough Claws ability that Mega Aerodactyl gained upon Mega Evolving. Beyond just unlocking secondary stab, which was already excellent for enabling Stone Edge by crushing Pokemon like Mean Shout and Chestnut, Tough Claws also unlocked the full potential of Mega Aerodactyl's coverage move pool. It boosted Aqua Tail, letting it more reliably rip through ground types. It boosted the Elemental Fangs, with Ice Fang fulfilling a similar role to Aqua Tail, while providing a more reliable hit against another top-tier UU threat, Hydreigon. It boosted Crunch, which was on the specific side, letting Aerodactyl hit would-be checks like Cresselia, Bronzong, and Doublade very hard. And on the subject of Dark-type coverage, Tough Claws also boosted Pursuit. Mega Aerodactyl wasn't what you think of when it came to dedicated trappers, but it pursued it incredibly efficiently simply because of how many Pokemon it chased out. At the very least, it was a great source of force chip damage on Pokemon before they retreated to their walling teammates, ensuring Mega Aerodactyl was making some form of progress, and it could use this tactic effectively on many of the Pokemon it threatened, like Entei and Moltres, but it was really at its best considering what some of the Pokemon it chased out were. For instance, it could prey on Roserade's low physical defense to really hit it hard as it fled from Wing Attack, while it really cemented its aforementioned domination of Mega Beedrill, and it excelled at punishing even certain key Pokemon that had solid physical bulk like Celebi. And it's not like Mega Aerodactyl had to pursue it either, far from it. Its move pool was nearly endless in its flexibility. It could take advantage of its Mega's highly appreciated bulk boost by sticking around with Roost, letting it both check opposing threats and throw around its own attacks in one. It could go for a late game sweep with Hone Claws, boosting not just its attack but even its accuracy, meaning it got to enjoy launching accurate Stone Edges. What a dream, even before taking into account how much more threatening they were, with the added power helping it break through bulky waters like Suicune and Slowking. Mega Aerodactyl was elite at fitting on just about every kind of team and adding peerless value. Yes, there were other very good Megas in the tier, so it was hardly the only one being used, but Mega Aerodactyl always stood above them all. Meanwhile, Base Aerodactyl, apart from occasionally being used in OU as part of the same kind of hyper offense team, this time pairing Volcarona with boosters like Mega Charizard X, returned to RU once again. The metagame was a lot bulkier now and lent itself to prolonged games between tanky Pokemon capable of withstanding hits, which wasn't much Aerodactyl's style, but it was still a very good Pokemon. Its excellent speed and solid power with Life Orb let it tear through most offensive teams with ease. It was so fast, in fact, it even outran some choice scarfers like Emvor and Hoopa. As As a bonus, Aerodactyl's hidden ability Unnerve was actually quite useful. Denying berries meant it could pursue even a dark weak Pokemon, guarding itself with Cobra Berry, and it was an excellent pursuiter, able to pick off Sigilif with the threat of Stone Edge, as well as the aforementioned Hoopa. This capped off an excellent generation for Aerodactyl. Aerodactyl's Mega even gave it a slight place in VGC. Its plethora of weaknesses, along with the fact that it didn't hit that hard, held it back, but it did have the enviable trait of absolutely destroying both Talonflame and Mega Charizard Y. It also matched up against it quite well. It was a limited but valuable niche, which was enough to afford it quite a few placements in the 2014 meta, like Keegan Beljanski, 9th at the Missouri Regionals, Sean Webb, 8th at the Oregon Regionals, Jonathan Mendoza, 11th at the California Regionals, Mike Selesky, 3rd, Florida Regionals, Chalky Horstein, 8th at the Utah Regionals, Blake Hopper, 7th at the Kansas Regionals, Ed Glover, 8th, and James Hudson, 11th at the Georgia Regionals, Gavin Michaels, 11th, and Carter Briggs, 15th at the Washington Regionals, Vieira and Ryuzaki top 8 Japan's Battle World Gloria National Tournament, Nikio Gokul, 7th at the South African Nationals, Nemanja Sandik, 3rd at the German Nationals, Barris Akos, 8th at the UK Nationals, Christopher Kahn, 9th at the Australian Nationals, and even at Worlds, Ryosuke Kosuge reached 5th and Yuichi Sasaki reached 16th, respectively. Post-Worlds were the few first regionals for the 2015 season, still used the 2014 rule set. We have Alex Valente, 12th, and Trista Medine, 13th at the Pennsylvania Regionals, Gabby Snyder, 5th, Texas Regionals, and Alexandria Klaus, 8th at the California Regionals. Mega Aerodactyl stopped being used with the expansion of ORAS, other than one appearance by Mion at the Japanese Regionals. But hey, it was still solidly popular in XY, especially after the Gloria tournament in Japan showed how apt it was at taking on some of the meta's biggest staples, and a couple of Worlds placements is downright superb, considering its complete non-existence previously. This capped off an excellent generation for Aero, and Generation 7 would bring the goods once again. As Aerodactyl, again, a top-tier UU Mega, perhaps it was no longer the Mega of the tier, as Mega Altaria's superb all-around utility meant it was similarly elite, but Mega Aerodactyl certainly wasn't anything less than top 2, and there was quite a bit of a distance between it and number 3. Even with the power creep of many formerly OU Pokemon dropping down, like Scizor and Latias, as well as Z-moves flying around, Mega Aerodactyl was still outstanding against just about everything for the same reasons. In addition to taking on familiar faces from Gen 6 like Celebi, it also thrived against many of the new Pokemon. For instance, it was a major thorn in the side of Gengar with its Tough Claws boosted pursuit. Mega Aerodactyl's utility was really on full display this time around, as while it had always been usable on a diverse array of team styles, this time it took things further by becoming an essential part of even hard stall. The stall playstyle, which came to dominate UU so hard, it eventually led to the ban of Quagsire, originated with Mega Aerodactyl in tow. Its ability to take on seemingly everything was well suited to a playstyle that, for all the strengths of its famously impenetrable defensive core, sometimes needed some fast-paced offense to play around the myriad threats in the tier. For instance, the known stall destroyer Nasty Plot Celebi was quite threatening, but with Mega Aerodactyl around, well, it wasn't an ironclad answer, but it provided both a revenge killer and the potential for a serious chunk of damage on the switch with its powerful pursuit. So wide was Aerodactyl's reach though, that it could help play around just about anything that might be concocted to break through the stall core, like other Nasty Plot users such as Togekiss and Infernape. Though Gen 7 UU stall was overpoweringly strong from many factors coming together to create the perfect storm, Mega Aerodactyl's incredible revenge killing and pursuit chip damage was a major part of it. Meanwhile, base Aerodactyl was decent in RU, its typing speed and pursuit valuable to assist against the metagame's powerful fire types Salazzle and Ninetales. It was similarly helpful against Swellow, which was especially unique and appreciated given how Swellow was incredibly fast in its own right. However, RU's power creep meant Aerodactyl's own power in conjunction with its frailty couldn't quite hack it well enough to be a mainstay, and thus it dropped to NU. There it was excellent. It donned an item it hadn't used since it so famously wielded it in its best gen, the third, Choice Band. Yes, Stealth Rock was a concern with locking into moves, especially without being able to roost, but so long as that was taken care of with team support, the rewards were huge. With its massive stone edges blasting through the tier's bulky waters like Blastoise and Vaporeon, while its pursuits became even more adept at picking off Sigilif, and with the extra power, even the dark neutral and more physically fragile Heliolisk. Being able to so effectively wall break and keep major threats in check was business as usual for Aerodactyl, but excellent as it was, what if it wanted to unleash major power while still being able to switch moves? Gen 7 put it in a unique position to do so, thanks to Z Crystals. With Flyneum Z, Aerodactyl could unleash its superpower Sky Attack turn 200 base power supersonic Sky Strike, obliterating neutral targets like Waters, only needing a bit of chip damage. In addition to such superb power, this set also allowed Aerodactyl to gain the flexibility of Roost, allowing allowing it to more freely switch into Pokemon like Incineroar and Braviary. Once again, Aerodactyl was a superb blend of offense and utility en route to being one of NU's best Pokemon, its speed and strength making it one of the metagame's most consistent performers and capping off another excellent generation overall. Megas weren't allowed for the 2017 VGC season, but base Aerodactyl found some utility, limited, but it had some solid traits. Amazing speed on par with meta staple Tapu Koko, valuable speed control in Tailwind, and the flinch-happy stab Rock Slide primarily threatening that other meta staple Arcanine. Additionally, it was uniquely strong at utilizing Skydrop to temporarily nullify a particular opponent, giving its ally Pokemon much more freedom to deal with a specific opposing target. It was a solid enough niche to notch Aerodactyl quite a few good placements, and they were Yuma Kinugawa 11th at the European International Championships London, Ismat Myron Beg 5th at the special event Kuala Lumpur, John Hugh 5th and Ashton Cox 13th at the Collinsville Regionals, Ashton Cox 13th and Daniel Parks 14th at the Oceania International Championships Melbourne, Brian Ameti 5th and Graham Ameti 7th at the Sydney Regionals, Kevin Swastik 8th at the Hartford Regionals, Giovanni Panarello 4th at the special event Torino, and once again Brian Ameti 3rd and Graham Ameti 4th at the Brisbane Regionals. That was the 2017 season. Aero wouldn't be seen again until 2019, where it developed a small niche even in the restricted format with both its base and mega form, as its speed and great matchup against fellow base 130 speed tier member Crobat, as well as doing decently into Mega Salamence and even Primal Groudon and Mega Rayquaza, allowed it plenty of opportunity for its utility. Its placements were Eduardo Cunha 11th at the Latin American International Championships with base Aerodactyl, David Hogan 29th at the Connecticut Regionals with Mega Aerodactyl, Malcolm McKellar 15th at the Oceania International Championships with base Aerodactyl, Trevor Rosberg 19th Wisconsin Regionals with Mega Aerodactyl, Matt Carter 3rd Sheffield Regionals with Mega Aerodactyl, Andre Fumis 7th at the Capina special event, Mega Aerodactyl. It was nice to see Aerodactyl find some VGC success once again. Now for the 8th generation, in which Mega Aerodactyl would go away, but base Aerodactyl gained several downright incredible buffs. First, heavy duty boots. No longer would it be plagued by the stealth rock it had once been so famous for setting, which incidentally, it would now be able to more effectively utilize its typing's many valuable resists in order to set once again. Second, dual wing beat. Actually reliable flying stab was excellent to have. It wasn't the brave bird that so many had longed for Aerodactyl to have, as in conjunction with Rockhead to deny recoil, it being credible, but hey, it hadn't gotten head smash for that purpose either, and damage wise, dual wing beat got the job done just fine, especially in conjunction with the third buff, Dragon Dance. Suddenly, Aerodactyl could completely take over late games. With Aerodactyl's tremendous speed, it left any prospective revenge killing attempt from Choice Scarfers in the dust, and the attack boost let it blast through weakened teams with ease. It was so much faster than Scarfers, in fact, that it could even choose to really cement its KOs with an adamant nature and lose out on nothing, well, after a boost anyway. It wasn't easy to give up the slew of Pokemon Aerodactyl outsped before a boost. Either way, it was a great problem to have, if it could even be called a problem, and was really more team dependent, based on if Aerodactyl was expected to hang back until a sweeping opportunity arose or not. Once again, Aerodactyl found itself in NU, though with quite a strong place in RU as well, and in both metas, Dragon Dance was hardly all it was doing, or even its primary option. In RU, it once again adopted the attacking set it had wielded for the past several generations, right down to Life Orb as its primary option. Of course, it could and did run heavy-duty boots effectively on such a set, but it really appreciated the extra power when dealing with old familiars like Metagross and Suicune. Either way, its primary update was dual wing beat, rounding out its classic Edgequake coverage, making it much easier for it to blast through targets like Celebi. This is not to say that Dragon Dance didn't pose a serious threat though, as if it didn't have enough going for it, Aerodactyl's Unnerve ability also meant you couldn't play around it with resist berries as many teams might against certain Dragon Dancers. In this case, Shuka Metagross wouldn't be able to weaken its Earthquake. In NU, Aerodactyl was even better, especially as the tier's lower stats meant it didn't require Life Orb's extra power, allowing it to freely bypass rocks with boots. Once again, it didn't primarily Dragon Dance, but this time around, its main set leaned more into utility. It still hit fast and hard, but rather than expand beyond Earthquake's coverage, it was more focused on the longevity boots afforded it, which alongside its strong matchups against anti-hazard tactics like Magic Bounce Xatu and Defog Mantine, made it an excellent stealth rock setter, sticking around with Roost to repeatedly set the rocks throughout longer games. In the event rocks could be used on a teammate, this Aerodactyl was still dedicated to support, preferring to use Toxic over a coverage option, letting it hinder the grounds and waters like Silvally Ground and Quagsire commonly used to check it. But of course, Dragon Dance was utterly ferocious late game, a lights out cleaner as a modern update on the proud Aerodactyl tradition. That still wasn't all either. Throughout the generation, Aerodactyl had a legitimate niche in Ubers, with its classic Focus Sash Stealth Rock set. Seems strange, but Aerodactyl was uniquely well well equipped to handle Gen 8 Uber's specific high-octane lead metagame. Hyper-offense teams made for fast-paced games with little opportunity to remove hazards should they start the game off on the right foot, and Aerodactyl did just that. It matched up positively against opposing sash hazard leads like Spike's Frostlass and Sticky Web Galvantula. In addition to outspeeding them and even having Rock Tomb speed drop to keep it ahead of Frostlass using the same strategy with Ice Wind, Aerodactyl could even slot Defog into its moveset to really commit to keeping the opponent's potentially ruinous hazards off should they manage to get a lair up. It didn't need Defog by any means, but the fact that it could made it even more consistent at setting the stage early. If it wasn't defogging, it would support its team further with Tailwind. While far from flashy, Aerodactyl was consistently one of the most reliable options for hyper offense lead. Aerodactyl didn't have much presence at all in the Dynamax-laden Gen 8 VGC metagame. It only managed a couple of appearances, but once again in the restricted format and both by the same player. John Hu used Aerodactyl to reach 12 at the 4th qualifier in the Winter Series of the Victory Road Circuit and 4th at the 5th qualifier of the same tournament. Not at all a bad postscript to the generation to be competing alongside Zamazenta Crowned and company. Now Aerodactyl would take the 9th generation off, but it would return in Pokemon Champions, along with its Mega. Both Base and Mega Aerodactyl have been quite strong in Champions VGC thus far. Their initial appeal came from how dominant they were against the monstrously dangerous Mega Charizard Y, which otherwise crushed nearly the entire meta, and this indeed was their greatest strength, but they quickly demonstrated great utility against the metagame at large. They possess a litany of valuable traits. Being as fast as they were with their solid attacking ability, Mega Aerodactyl really piling on the power, but even Base Aerodactyl hitting well, not just for the opportunities afforded to it by its speed, but by having its stab option being that eternally trusty VGC move, Rock Slide, in addition to also threatening other meta staples like Incineroar, Pelipper, and Mega Frostlass and Staraptor. Its dual target high flinch rate was able to pull out all sorts of stops in tough situations. Beyond attacking, the arrows also offered more direct utility, primarily in excellent speed control with Tailwind, but also valuable were fast taunts for denying setup, and even the potential for denying opposing spread moves with Wide Guard. Sash Aerodactyl had the flexibility of being able to take a hit and thus continuously provide its utility in spite of its many weaknesses, while Mega Aerodactyl was a more directly dangerous threat and thus an excellent option on dual Mega teams to provide flexibility and letting them adapt their matchup against Mega Charizard Y. Their arrows are incredibly useful and therefore absolutely everywhere in usage. In fact, they're so innately valuable that this usage has carried over even into the 1.1 patch, and as such we had to limit the placements to top 4, which says it all. Using Aerodactyl is just playing the meta, and thus out of the enormous field of Aerodactyl users, the most successful have been Sao Wei Harng and Ing Chi Woon, 1st and 2nd respectively at the Malaysia Master Ball League, Jidarin Roj Maha Mongkol, 1st at the Thailand Master Ball League, Li Jing Yang, 2nd at the Singapore Master Ball League, Chen Yu Wei and Liu Jiangting, 1st and 2nd at the Taiwan Master Ball League respectively, Marco Silva 1st at the 2nd Champions Arena, and at the North American International Championships New Orleans, the 1st and 2nd slots both use Arrow, with 1st place Francesco Piopero and 2nd place Eric Rios, both bringing Mega Aerodactyl. And now we can answer the question, so how great was Aerodactyl actually? Well, its career has by and large been as eventful as it has been long. Yes, the first gen wasn't much for it, amusing niche of countering Mew and Ubers aside, but starting in Gen 2, it did at least something somewhere, like becoming a late, not overwhelming yet valuable member of Gen 2 UU, and often did a lot more than that. It shaped Generation 3 around its terrifying choice band set, and starting in Gen 4 became synonymous with the iconic new strategy of the Focus Sash Stealth Rock lead, which it would carry over the next several generations, all while thriving in Gen 5 RU or having its Mega Evolution absolutely dominate UU in Gen 6 and 7. Gen 8 saw its base form's lower tier career continue well thanks to the additions of Heavy Duty Boots and even Dragon Dance. Then after taking Gen 9 off, Pokemon Champions saw both base and Mega Aerodactyl hit the VGC scene in a major way. They previously had surprisingly decent niches, but now they were right in the spotlight, their initial use of fending off Mega Charizard Y giving way to their many other talents. Overall, Aerodactyl has had a superb competitive career. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Espion Lover, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Palamute, Plutonian Shores, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soars and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zachary Stimson, Zathor for their major support of our videos.